I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at the impact of World War II. So what we'll be looking at is kind of the post-war planning during this period of time, the goals of Allied leaders. We'll look at the steps the United States and other countries took to avoid World War III. And we'll look at the impact of World War II on the United States. Okay, question one. Compare World War I and World War II. So it's always good to reflect back and look at the different wars in the context of each other. Back in 1918, the German Kaiser, he surrendered before Allies could invade Germany. World War I was a much more limited war in comparison to World War II, whereas World War II, Germans and the Japanese continued to fight long after the war was all but lost for both of those countries. Germany fought until Hitler committed suicide, with the Allied troops already in Berlin. Japan fought not until one, but rather two atomic bombs were dropped on Japanese cities. So losing 80,000 people instantaneously and seeing the sheer devastation of the first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was not enough to convince the Japanese to surrender. They needed to see a second bomb be dropped. That bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and then the Japanese finally did surrender. Okay, there were a series of conferences. A conference is basically a gathering of some of the world leaders at the time. At both Yalta and Potsdam, Allies gathered here to plan for the post-war world, especially for the future of Eastern Europe. In both conferences, the United States wanted the Eastern European countries to hold free elections. At Yalta, this took place before Germany surrendered. The Allies discussed the final strategy for the war. The war in Europe was over when the Potsdam Conference occurred, so the Allies then decided to divide Germany and other parts of Europe into zones of occupation. So basically, they're at first at Yalta planning for what would they hope to be the outcome of World War II, and Potsdam was more of a post-war conference to look at what to do with the regions of Germany that would now have to be under Allied control. Three out of the problems that arose at Potsdam and Yalta foreshadow the Cold War that the United States and the Soviet Union would engage in later on in history. Well, especially at Potsdam, a lot of people believe this is the unofficial start of the Cold War, which meaning no longer was Franklin Roosevelt alive at Potsdam. At Potsdam, it was Harry Truman, the American president, who was dealing with Stalin. It was perceived that Roosevelt had a little bit better working relationship and more of a trust relationship with Stalin than would Truman. The United States wanted free elections in Eastern Europe, but the Soviets were reluctant to agree. As we know, historically, eventually the Soviet Union is going to basically take control of most of Eastern Europe, but they had not yet done so. So that's why they're hesitant to allow the free elections in Eastern Europe. European countries divided among the Allies, which led to the divisions in the Cold War. How did the Allies divide Germany after World War II? Between Democratic West Germany and Communist East Germany. As you can see there, there's 4 Allied zones in Germany. The British controlled the northwestern zone. The Germans did not have any control whatsoever, completely, or any autonomy in their own country. Soviet Union, they controlled the eastern zone, which included the original capital city of Berlin. As you can see, Berlin is completely contained within East Germany. It's also situation 2 that eventually Berlin is going to be subdivided as well. That's why Berlin's kind of in white, because that's going to be subdivided down the middle between East and West Berlin, West Berlin being democratic, East Berlin being communist. And then France, they controlled the territory that basically was in southwestern Germany. This would be the area that bordered mostly France. And then the United States controlled a pretty big piece in the south central region of Germany. Five, how did the Soviet Union attempt to influence Eastern Europe? They attempted to pressure Eastern European governments into establishing pro-communist governments in their country. So they're basically twisting the arms of citizens and government in some of these Eastern European regions. They wanted these countries, including Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other countries, to embrace communism. Six, what happened in China and Japan after World War II. So we don't want to just look at it from a Eurocentric perspective. We also want to take a look too and see how Asia changed in the aftermath of World War II. The Chinese Civil War. Well, the Chinese Civil War had broken out prior to the Japanese invasion of China. We had an ongoing struggle between the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of nationalist China for a long period of time. And then eventually Mao Zedong would be basically a communist leader, kind of a insurgent movement to try and remove Chiang Kai-shek from power and to install Mao Zedong into power as the communist leader of the country. The United States tried to supervise the transition from a pre to post World War II Japan, a transition from a military dictatorship to a democratic form of government. 7, why did the Soviet Union and the United States emerge as the two main world powers in the aftermath of World War II? Well, the United States had a strong economy, a powerful military, and they had the military advantage at this point in time and a strong deterrent in the atom bomb. Soviet Union had a very large and powerful Red Army. And what was really true about Stalin and his Red Army is they came into Eastern Europe during World War II, and they never left. So basically their troops possessed this region here that I'm trying to outline here, and they never pulled their troops out. So basically, in the aftermath of World War II, you have the two superpowers. You see the United States represented on the left there, with Uncle Sam, everybody's uncle, money, finances, kind of a bit of a attitude. You see the big Russian bear representing the Soviet Union on the right side there. And that's basically the two sides' main adversaries during the Cold War. 8, how did the attitude of Americans towards world organizations begin to change after World War II? The United States refused originally after World War I to join the League of Nations because they wanted to remain isolated and follow the policy of isolationism or neutrality. After World War II, Americans were more readily available, were more ready to embrace a leadership role on the world stage. The United States wanted to go to the forefront instead of staying in the background, which they were doing prior to World War II. And since World War II, the United States would never again take a back seat in world affairs. After World War II, the United States began working with other countries to establish the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. What changing beliefs motivated these actions? Well, the United States believed it was important to have an international presence and link to the economies of major nations around the world. They believed this could promote global trade. In many ways, they were 50 or 60 years ahead of their time because globalization in the 2000s has really taken over the world economy, and they were really very proactive in pushing forward with international trade in the aftermath of World War II. 10, the goal of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade was to expand world trade by reducing tariffs. What is a tariff, and why would reducing tariffs lead to an increase in trade? Well, again, this should be a review at this point in time in your life, but a tariff is a tax on foreign goods. The purpose of a tariff is to tax a good or product coming into your country, raises the price of that product, and then encourages you to purchase goods or products made in your own country. If you do cut back on tariffs and there's lower taxes on foreign goods, people in other countries are more likely to trade with each other because foreign goods are more affordable. So there's the pros and cons. The pro of placing a tariff on a good is it encourages people to buy American-made products. The negative of a tariff is it discourages international world trade. 11, what is the purpose of the United Nations? Well, obviously to promote world and international peace and security. 12, what is the United Nations General Assembly? It's the general legislative body of the United Nations. It's made up of all member countries. Today there are around 192 member countries. When voting on a resolution or a bill, each nation receives one vote. In addition to the General Assembly, the United Nations also has the UN Security Council. It's made up of 5 permanent UN Security Council members. The 5 high-ranking members of the United Nations Security Council are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. There's also 10 non-permanent members. They're elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms, but they're ineligible for immediate re-election. All decisions require great power, unanimity, or unanimous vote. So for any resolution that's put in front of the UN, these 5 permanent UN Security Council members have the veto power. Only those 5 permanent. So if you're a temporary member of the UN Security Council, one of those 10 non-permanent members, you could be a member, you can voice your opinion, you can help drive a policy decision, but ultimately you still only have the 1 vote, same as you would in the General Assembly. And you cannot block or veto bills or resolutions. Only those 5 countries, the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and Russia. Originally it was the Soviet Union, but then it went to the Russian Federation after the Soviet Union broke up during the early 1990s. Okay, let's move on now to 14. It's based on the excerpt there from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Recognition of inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. So reading that excerpt, what does that statement mean? So unless all countries recognize all people have basic human rights, there can never be any permanent peace in the world. What's the Geneva Convention? What role does it play? It's an agreement between countries around the world to provide the humane treatment of wounded soldiers and prisoners of war. It's still around today, and in conjunction with The Hague, which is an international court sanctioned by the United Nations, it oversees international actions. Some of the powerful Nazis defended themselves. That was what is remembered as the Nuremberg trials by saying they were just following Hitler's orders. Was this a reasonable defense? Why or why not? So the Nuremberg trials, just to give you a quick background on that, they were put together as a commission in the aftermath of World War II to investigate the horrendous crimes committed by Adolf Hitler during the Holocaust. It was designed to try and pass judgment on the perpetrators of the Holocaust. As a result of the Nuremberg trials, many Nazi leaders and perpetrators were imprisoned or, in some cases, executed. Obviously, this is not an acceptable defense. There's many of these Nazis on trial that committed tremendous human rights crimes, including murder. It doesn't matter whether or not you're under the orders. You're smart enough as an adult to decide whether or not killing innocent children, women, senior citizens, for no reason whatsoever is an acceptable task or not. It comes down to the basic idea of what is right and what is wrong. Okay, 17. Why does the power of the government tend to increase during wartime? So we look at the power of the government. Obviously, during the time of crisis, any crisis, whether it's wartime or it could be what we're dealing with now with the pandemic, obviously have to take more dramatic steps to help protect the country, help to protect the citizens. So in order to win a war, the government takes control of resources, tries to control public opinion. This includes censorship and wartime economic measures such as rationing. A president often needs to make rapid military decisions, and there's not always enough time to gain the full consent of Congress. So at times, they need to unilaterally make decisions in the best interest of the country. That's where the trust factor between the American public and the president comes in. If the president betrays that trust, then obviously it could be a situation where you lose trust in the government and in the president, and then you may not believe what they're telling you in terms of the need to, let's say, wear a mask or quarantine, or in the case of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt requests that you give up certain items, you don't have access to certain food or consumer goods. Well, I mean, if the president didn't build up your trust, you might not necessarily accept those restrictions. 18 lists the ways World War II impacted the United States, both at home and its relationship around the world. Well, domestically, the United States economy continued to grow, power of government increased, especially the executive branch. African Americans began to push for equal rights as they stepped up, proved themselves to be equal to their white counterparts. The United States emerged as a world power. International trade increased. 19, how many people died during the war? Well, there's a few, slightly different statistics on this here, but around 55 million in total died during World War II. Kind of process that number for a second. 55 million people died. Roughly half were civilians, those who got caught up in the crossfire. Roughly 12 million killed in German camps. 20 million Soviet civilians died, which was roughly 10% of their population. 10 million Chinese died. We don't really emphasize the ongoing fighting in Asia between Japan and China, but the sheer number there gives you a pretty good illustration of how terrible it was there in Asia. Americans, over 400,000 Americans died during World War II. The long-term impact of World War II obviously is still being felt. The United States emerged as the strongest military and economic nation in the world. Soviet Union, communism emerged as their enemy. The atomic or nuclear arms race began as the nations began to severely and strongly compete to build up their weapons. The Cold War started. The United Nations formed. The Nuremberg trials tried Nazis and exposed the horrors of the Holocaust. Some lessons that we can learn from World War II: the importance of addressing threats before they get out of hand. Wars require coordinated efforts both on the home and war fronts to win. We learned about the importance of alliances. And then ultimately, the horrors of warfare came home for many to experience. Take a moment to get down anything you need to. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.